The horizon tilted until the world seemed to spin upside down. Sunlight glared off the ocean below, now a dazzling mirror high above. Inside the cramped cockpit of his F-4F Wildcat, Lieutenant John Jack Barlow pulled the stick gently, feeling the straps bite into his shoulders as gravity fought to drag him toward the canopy. He was flying inverted, upside down, a maneuver so unnatural, so seemingly suicidal, that even his own squadron mates had called it madness. Below, or rather above, the shimmering blue expanse of the Pacific stretched endlessly, dotted with tiny white caps and the ghostly shadows of distant islands. And there, cutting through the air like silver blades, came the enemy, the Mitsubishi A6M0, Japan's elegant yet deadly symbol of aerial supremacy. The Zeros moved with effortless grace, their movements precise, almost predatory. In early 1942, these planes owned the sky. Jack's voice crackled through the radio, heavy with strain and disbelief. "They're overshooting. They can't follow. It's working." For the first time in months, American pilots had found a move that the Zeros couldn't match. An inversion roll that turned dogfighting theory on its head, quite literally. To most, it looked like insanity. Flying upside down wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The Wildcat's carbureted engine could sputter, the pilot's blood could rush to his head, and visibility became a nightmare. But for Jack Barlow and his comrades, this inverted flight wasn't a stunt. It was survival. It was defiance. And soon it would become a symbol of American ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. The story of why American pilots began flying upside down is not just about one daring maneuver. It's about desperation and creativity born from defeat. It's about young men in the vast emptiness of the Pacific, realizing that to stay alive, they'd have to unlearn everything they'd been taught. By early 1942, the war in the Pacific had turned into a nightmare of aerial humiliation. The Japanese Zero dominated every engagement. It climbed faster, turned tighter, and struck with lethal precision. American aircraft, like the F-4F Wildcat or the early P-40 Warhawk, were slower and less agile. In dogfights, the Zero could practically dance around them. Every traditional tactic failed. Every maneuver taught in American flight schools ended the same way, in flames, spiraling down into the Pacific. But out of that chaos came a handful of pilots who refused to accept defeat. They began to notice patterns, small cracks in the myth of Japanese invincibility. The Zero was extraordinary, yes, but not perfect. It had weaknesses. It lacked armor, its fuel tanks weren't self-sealing, and its control surfaces stiffened at high speeds. Most importantly, it couldn't handle negative G maneuvers. Any motion that pushed the pilot upward against the straps rather than downward into the seat. Flying upside down exploited that flaw. It forced the Zero into a regime of flight it wasn't built for. It was a strange, risky tactic. But for American pilots staring at the impossible, it was a glimmer of hope. That first inverted roll, performed not in training but in the heat of battle, would mark the beginning of a revolution in aerial combat thinking. It would turn a seemingly doomed air campaign into one of innovation and eventual dominance. The idea that you could change the tide of war simply by flipping your plane upside down might sound absurd, but that's what makes it true. In the crucible of war, absurdity often becomes genius. This is the story of how American pilots turned the sky upside down, and how that act of rebellion, born in desperation, helped them defeat one of the most feared fighter planes in history. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States entered the war with pride and with arrogance. America believed its industrial power, its machines, and its pilots could quickly turn the tide in the Pacific. But the first months of 1942 shattered that illusion. The Japanese Zero, light, agile, and shockingly advanced became the embodiment of a new kind of warfare, one that the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps were unprepared to fight. At first glance, the Zero seemed almost fragile. Its thin aluminum skin gleamed like a dragonfly's wing in the sun. Yet that apparent fragility hid a terrifying truth. The aircraft was designed for one thing: absolute aerial dominance through maneuverability. The Zero could turn inside any Allied fighter. It could climb like nothing American pilots had ever seen. It was fast, but more importantly, it could stay in the air seemingly forever, thanks to its exceptional range. In those early days, the Pacific was a deadly classroom. The Americans flew the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a sturdy but clumsy machine compared to the Japanese Marvel. The Wildcat was slower, heavier, and less responsive. It had armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, luxuries the Zero lacked. But in a one-on-one dogfight, those defenses only prolonged the inevitable. Japanese pilots, many of them veterans of the war in China, flew with ruthless precision. Their flight schools trained them in aggressive tactics, emphasizing energy management and coordinated team attacks. They called it Buntai Kodo, the group maneuver. American pilots, on the other hand, were still flying as individuals, relying on instincts and outdated doctrine that favored close-turning dogfights. By the time the Battle of Wake Island, the Philippines, and the Coral Sea unfolded, one fact was clear: the Zero ruled the sky. The U.S. military began to refer to it with awe and dread, as if it were a supernatural force. Pilots whispered stories of ghost planes that could outclimb and outturn anything the Allies sent up. In mess halls and debriefing rooms across the Pacific, a quiet despair settled in. The first time American intelligence examined a captured Zero in 1942, engineers were stunned. The aircraft weighed only about 5,500 pounds, nearly a ton lighter than the Wildcat, and its wings were so finely balanced that it could perform tight loops at speeds that would tear most planes apart. The Japanese had built something revolutionary, and it was annihilating the competition. One man who grasped the scale of the challenge early was John S. Thatch, a Navy lieutenant commander from Pine Bluff, Arkansas. A thoughtful strategist, Thatch realized that traditional turn-and-burn tactics would only lead to slaughter. He began experimenting with formations and teamwork to counter the Zero's advantages. Out of his notes and experiments came the Thatch Weave, a defensive pattern where two fighters covered each other, forcing Zeros into traps instead of duels. It was brilliant, but even that wasn't enough on its own. Pilots needed something more, an instinctive trick that could save their lives in one-on-one combat. Something unpredictable. Something the Japanese wouldn't expect. At the same time, far from headquarters, in the tropical heat of the Solomon Islands, another group of aviators was learning the same lesson the hard way. The Cactus Air Force, the ragtag defenders of Guadalcanal, faced daily attacks from superior Japanese squadrons. Their makeshift airfields turned to mud after tropical rains. Mechanics scavenged spare parts from wrecked planes. Fuel was rationed. Every mission felt like a gamble with death. Yet amid that chaos, the seeds of innovation began to sprout. Some pilots noticed that the Zero's behavior changed in certain dives and rolls. When pushed into negative Gs, when the pilot was lifted out of his seat instead of pressed into it, the Zero's engine sputtered, its controls stiffened, and its elegant agility vanished. The plane seemed to stumble in the air, like a dancer suddenly losing rhythm. At first, it was just a curiosity, but in the hands of desperate men, curiosity becomes survival. Pilots began to play with that weakness, rolling inverted, diving away upside down, even flying for seconds at a time in positions that made their stomachs churn. They didn't yet have a name for it. To most, it was that crazy upside-down trick. But it worked. The war was teaching its cruel lesson. When you face an enemy stronger, faster, and more experienced, you don't beat him by fighting fair. You beat him by changing the rules or by flying upside down until the rules no longer apply. The American pilots of 1942 didn't know it yet, but the first spark of tactical revolution had already been lit. By mid-1942, the Pacific had become a graveyard of burning metal and shattered hope. The ocean seemed endless, swallowing both wreckage and memory. Every day, young American pilots took off from primitive island strips or carrier decks, and many never came back. The myth of the Zero was no longer myth. It was cold, undeniable fact. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the air reeked of fuel and sweat. The men of the Cactus Air Force joked darkly that the runway was the most bombed piece of real estate on Earth. The truth was, they were running on fumes, spare parts scavenged from wrecks, ammunition rationed to the last belt. The Marines and Navy pilots stationed there were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. Each morning, the same cruel ritual played out. The sound of approaching engines from the north. Bogies, altitude 8,000, inbound fast. Sirens wailed. Mechanics scrambled for cover. Pilots sprinted toward their aircraft, boots pounding the dusty ground. Minutes later, they were airborne, climbing into a sky already filled with black puffs of flak and silver streaks of death. Against the Zeros, the Wildcats looked clumsy, like iron birds beating their wings against glass. In turning fights, the Americans were shredded. The Japanese pilots, flying with the calm precision of samurai, could loop and twist around them in seconds. Every dogfight ended the same way, with an American in the sun's glare pulling for altitude, only to see tracer rounds rip through his fuselage. Lieutenant Ed O'Hare, one of the Navy's rising stars, described it best. You feel like you're fighting ghosts. They appear out of nowhere, slide onto your tail, and vanish before you can even turn. Morale plummeted. New pilots, barely out of training, were sent into battle after a few hours of briefing. Many never fired a single shot before being shot down. The veterans who survived too many missions carried the haunted look of men twice their age. At night, the officers' tents filled with silence. No boasting, no singing, just the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional nervous laugh over a bottle of whiskey. Every loss cut deeper because each pilot knew the faces behind the call signs, the man who used to share a cigarette, the one who wrote letters home to a girl in Kansas, the one who never came back from patrol. It wasn't just the losses. It was the feeling of helplessness. The traditional American way of flying, aggressive, bold, reliant on power and courage, had met its limit. Courage alone could not overcome physics. The Zero's design broke every rule the Americans understood. Their planes stalled earlier in turns. Their engines choked under negative Gs. Their tactics, drilled into them in flight school, now felt like suicide notes. Some commanders began to wonder if the Pacific could even be held. Reports poured in from the Coral Sea and Midway. Yes, victories had come, but at a brutal cost. Behind every success story was a growing realization. The enemy still ruled the air in one-on-one combat. American pilots were surviving by chance, not by superiority. In those months, flight instructors at bases from San Diego to Espiritu Santo began to see a pattern in the debriefings. Pilots who survived often reported bizarre maneuvers, rolls, dives, or negative G-flips that momentarily threw off their pursuers. They didn't plan them. They just reacted instinctively as their training collapsed under pressure. And somehow, it saved their lives. One Marine pilot described it this way: "I pushed the stick forward and rolled. Everything went red. My head felt like it would burst. But the Zero, it shot right past me. I looked up, and there it was, hanging there, like it didn't know what to do." Still, most commanders dismissed these accounts as panic reactions, not tactics. Flying inverted for more than a few seconds was risky. The Wildcat's carburetor engine could cut out if fuel flow was interrupted, and disorientation at low altitude could kill faster than any enemy bullet. Yet the stories kept coming. Tales of near-death and miraculous escapes, of pilots who swore that rolling upside down or dropping inverted saved them from certain destruction. In the mess tent, such talk was met with nervous laughter. "You trying to be a bat, Miller? What's next? Flying backward?" But beneath the jokes, something was changing. The men were starting to think differently, to experiment in the air, to bend the rules of flight. The American forces had reached their breaking point, and breaking points are where innovation begins. By late 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch's WWII had given them a team-based defense, but individual pilots still needed a personal weapon, a trick of the sky that could let them survive those precious few seconds when the Zero was on their tail. And somewhere in that chaotic dance of trial and terror, a few daring pilots would discover exactly that. They would find that by turning the world upside down, literally, they could rewrite the rules of aerial combat. The storm had reached its peak. The next step would come not from headquarters or manuals, but from instinct, from the split-second decision of a pilot who refused to die in a straight line. The sun over the Solomon Islands was brutal that day, a blinding orb that turned the sky into molten glass. Lieutenant Jack Barlow and his wingman were on patrol over Iron Bottom Sound when the warning came. "Bandits, 3 o'clock high, multiple bogies inbound." They climbed to meet them, the engines roaring like beasts straining against the leash. Moments later, the world erupted into chaos. A swarm of Zeros fell upon them, quick, elegant, merciless. Barlow jerked his Wildcat into a hard left bank, but the Japanese pilot stayed glued to his tail, matching every move. The tracers sliced past his canopy like red-hot needles. He pulled harder, feeling the airframe groan under the G's. The Zero tightened the turn again, closer, closer, until the American could almost see the white scarf fluttering in the enemy cockpit. Then something inside him snapped, or perhaps something awakened. Instead of climbing or tightening the turn, Barlow shoved the stick forward and rolled. Instinct, not thought. The horizon spun. His stomach lurched. Suddenly the sky and sea traded places. He was inverted, flying upside down at nearly 300 knots. The Zero followed for a fraction of a second, then wobbled, hesitated, and slid out of position. Barlow didn't wait to question it. He pushed the dive, rolled again, and pulled into level flight. Behind him, the Japanese fighter tumbled helplessly downward, unable to keep up. Barlow exhaled. He was alive. That moment, fleeting, instinctive, marked the beginning of what pilots would later call the inverted brake. It wasn't a planned maneuver, not at first. It was born out of pure survival, but it worked. Word spread quickly. At Henderson Field, pilots began experimenting, comparing notes between missions. Some called it the upside-down roll. Others joked, flying wrong side up. But whatever the name, they all noticed the same thing. The Zero couldn't handle it. Japanese aircraft, especially the early A6M2 model, had gravity-fed carburetors that starved the engine during negative-G flight. In an inverted dive, the fuel momentarily stopped flowing. The engine sputtered, losing power just when agility mattered most. American planes, though heavier and slower, could exploit this flaw by forcing the fight into that forbidden zone. By late 1942, instructors at the front lines began teaching pilots a simple rule. Don't turn with a zero. Dive, roll, go inverted if you have to. It went against everything they'd learned. To push the stick forward instead of pulling back, to surrender altitude deliberately, felt like suicide. But when executed correctly, it flipped the advantage. For the first time, American pilots had a way to break the spell. At first, command headquarters dismissed the reports. "Flying upside down in combat?" one senior officer scoffed. "Sounds like hysteria, not tactics." But the results spoke louder than disbelief. A patrol over Guadalcanal in October 1942 proved the point. A squadron of Wildcats engaged a group of Zeros head-on. Two American pilots, Lieutenant Sam Harris and Ensign Carl White, found themselves trapped in a climbing turn, losing altitude fast. Remembering the briefing, Harris shouted over the radio, "Invert! Carl, invert!" Both men rolled their planes upside down, diving away at full throttle. The pursuing Zeros tried to follow and failed. Their engines coughed, wings shuddered, and two of them plunged into the sea. It was the first documented success of the maneuver in recorded combat. Soon, the tactic spread across carrier groups like wildfire. Pilots who once cursed their aircraft now began to understand its hidden strengths. The Wildcat might not be able to turn inside a Zero, but it could dive faster, withstand more punishment, and, now, perform maneuvers that the Japanese could not replicate. Some even began practicing extended inverted flight, discovering that the Wildcat's rugged engine could endure short bursts of negative G without stalling. The key was control, keeping it brief, just long enough to disrupt the enemy's aim, to make him overshoot, to break the rhythm of the chase. One veteran described it later. It was like flipping the board in a chess game. Suddenly the hunter became the hunted. The Zero would stall, and I'd roll right back on top of him. Of course, the new trick came at a cost. Flying upside down was physically punishing. Blood rushed to the head. Vision blurred. The Pacific sun blazed through the canopy, burning into the pilot's eyes. The cockpit became a torture chamber of sweat, noise, and gravity turned cruel. But to the men who had seen too many friends die, the pain was worth it. For the first time, they had a choice, a way out. Back at headquarters, flight analysts began to take notice. Reports from Guadalcanal and the Coral Sea mentioned repeated successes with the inverted dive escape. By 1943, training manuals subtly incorporated lessons learned in the field. Use your aircraft's strengths, avoid prolonged turning fights, and exploit the enemy's engine weakness. And yet, beyond the technical analysis, something deeper had changed. The American pilots, once reactive, terrified, fighting with the weight of defeat, were now adapting. They were thinking like innovators, like survivors. The upside-down mindset wasn't just about flight physics. It was about mentality. They had learned to see the sky differently. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, where one wrong move meant death, a handful of men had decided to turn convention and gravity upside down. And in doing so, they turned the tide of the air war. By early 1943, something extraordinary had happened. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American pilots no longer looked to the sky with dread. They looked with intent. The shift was subtle at first, the kind of change that begins not in factories or command rooms, but in the minds of the men who fought. Those who once clung to desperation now carried quiet confidence. The inverted brake, once dismissed as lunacy, had become an art, refined, practiced, and deadly. When the Battle of the Bismarck Sea erupted in March 1943, the difference was unmistakable. American and Australian forces struck a Japanese convoy north of New Guinea, and the skies filled with dueling fighters. Zeros dove in to defend the transports, but they met a new kind of opponent. The U.S. Wildcats and P-38 Lightnings fought with rhythm and purpose, rolling, diving, and flipping in brief flashes of inversion. Every time a Zero tried to latch onto a tail, the American plane rolled upside down and plunged away, forcing its pursuer into negative G. Engines sputtered. Formations broke. The Japanese advantage, so absolute a year earlier, was dissolving before their eyes. Pilots who survived those encounters began to describe an almost eerie sensation, the feeling of control returning. One after another, combat reports listed Zeros shot down not because of superior firepower, but because of psychological disruption. The Japanese pilots, conditioned to expect predictable behavior, suddenly faced chaos. Aircraft vanishing beneath them, rolling inverted at impossible angles, climbing out of dives where no one should survive. The Americans had learned to weaponize unpredictability. By mid-1943, the lessons were codified. New pilots arriving in the Pacific received informal briefings that mixed folklore and physics. Don't dogfight, instructors warned. Use your speed. Dive, roll, and if they're on your tail, flip the world upside down. What had begun as desperation now entered doctrine. The tactics spread beyond the Wildcat squadrons. Pilots of the new F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair refined it further. These aircraft, powered by massive radial engines and boasting superior roll rates, could perform inverted dives and recover cleanly. The Hellcat especially became the embodiment of this new American philosophy: heavy, rugged, built for energy fighting, not turning duels. And in that philosophy lay the quiet echo of those early upside-down pioneers. When the great carrier battles of 1944 unfolded, the Philippine Sea, the Marianas Turkey Shoot, American pilots entered combat with overwhelming confidence. Their machines were faster, yes, but more importantly, their mindset had evolved. They no longer chased turning fights. They dictated them. If the enemy tried to roll in pursuit, the American dove inverted, forcing the Zero into its fatal weakness. Time after time, Japanese formations disintegrated. The results were staggering. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea alone, more than 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day. The once invincible Zero had become obsolete, not only because of American industry, but because of American adaptation. Tactics born in the mud of Guadalcanal now ruled the open sea. Yet victory never came without cost. Flying inverted under combat stress remained perilous. Dozens of pilots died in training or in misjudged dives, pushing their planes beyond limits. Even the experienced ones sometimes blacked out, blood rushing to the brain as gravity reversed. The maneuver required absolute trust in the machine, in one's instincts, in fate itself. Some men never returned from their experiments. Their sacrifice, though often unheralded, forged the foundation of a new era in aerial warfare. The Japanese, for their part, tried to adapt. Engineers modified the Zero's carburation system in later variants, reducing its vulnerability to negative G flight. Pilots were retrained to avoid overcommitment in vertical maneuvers. But by then it was too late. American fighters had outgrown the duel entirely. Their tactics now favored hit and run, slashing attacks from altitude, energy retention, teamwork. The inverted trick was no longer a gimmick. It was a symbol, a bridge between old dogfighting romanticism and modern aerial strategy. In 1945, when the final battles of the Pacific raged over Okinawa and the home islands, many of the veterans from those early days still flew, older, wiser, carrying ghosts with them. They no longer needed to roll upside down to win. But every time they did, they remembered the feeling, the moment when the world turned on its head and death blinked first. The Pacific sky had been reclaimed not just by superior machines but by imagination. And in war, imagination is sometimes the deadliest weapon of all. The war ended, but the sky kept its secrets. For the men who had lived inside that blue chaos, who had felt the world flip upside down in more ways than one, the end of the Pacific campaign brought neither triumph nor peace, only silence. The roar of engines faded, replaced by the hum of memory. In the years that followed, aviation historians would speak of aircraft models, engine ratios, turning radii. They would compare specifications, graphs, and statistics, seeking logic in a conflict that often defied it. But the pilots who had been there, who had risked their lives flying inverted over a hostile sea, knew that the real victory wasn't just mechanical, it was human. Flying upside down had begun as an act of desperation, a trick to cheat death. Yet it became a philosophy, a testament to the unyielding creativity that defines those who refuse to surrender. The tactic itself would soon vanish from manuals, replaced by new generations of aircraft that could pull impossible Gs and fight at supersonic speeds. Jets did not need to flip the world over to escape a pursuer. They could simply outrun one. But the spirit behind that maneuver, the willingness to turn convention on its head, never disappeared. Many of the men who first rolled inverted in combat never made it home. Others returned to quiet lives, teaching, farming, raising families. Some became test pilots, helping shape the jet age. And when they spoke of the war, if they spoke of it at all, they did so with the calm detachment of men who had stared too long into chaos and learned to live with it. Lieutenant Jack Barlow, who had survived that first accidental inversion over the Solomons, rarely talked about his experiences. When pressed in an interview decades later, he smiled faintly and said, "It wasn't courage, it was instinct. You just did what you had to do, and sometimes what you had to do didn't make sense until it worked." That statement captures more than a tactical lesson. It speaks to the essence of human adaptability, that strange blend of fear and brilliance that emerges only under pressure. War, for all its horror, has always been a forge for invention. From radar to jets, from encryption to medicine, necessity drags imagination into reality. But few inventions are as poetic as the idea of flying upside down to survive. It defies logic. It defies comfort. It demands the pilot to literally reverse his perspective, to see the sky as the sea, the horizon as an illusion. In that moment, everything you believe about balance, safety, and direction vanishes. All that remains is instinct and the thin, trembling thread of faith that the world will right itself again. Perhaps that is why this story endures. Because it isn't only about war or aircraft or tactics. It's about the human condition itself, our stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable, our ability to find a way out even when the world has turned against us. The American pilots of the Pacific did not win because they were stronger or faster. They won because they learned to adapt, to see differently, to think differently, to fight differently. They learned that sometimes, to rise above your enemy, you first have to turn your world upside down. Today, as modern jets scream across the same skies those men once fought in, the ghosts of their courage linger in the contrails. Somewhere between the clouds and the sea lies the memory of those who dared to roll inverted, and in doing so, changed the course of aerial warfare forever. The legacy of the upside-down pilots is not just written in history books. It's written in every innovation born from audacity, in every moment where fear meets creativity. Because sometimes to find the right path forward, you must first look at the world from an entirely different angle. And when the sky itself becomes your enemy, the only choice left is to fly upside down.